So here's the abstract. So this Larker paper, the reason I like it is because it has this companion piece that talks about how troublesome it is. And Robert Bloomfield is just very well respected in the field. And to be able to read his point of view on this paper is very instructive to us. You know what? This doesn't work over there.
Oh, okay.
That one doesn't work.
You need a new computer.
Okay, I'll get it. I think
Okay.
it'll work. Yeah, is there an on-off switch? Yeah, on.
No.
It's on. Yeah.
No.
Okay, it'll work in a second.
Okay.
If not, that's fine. Okay, so this paper is about detecting deception in the quarterly conference calls, and they then use what they gather from the quarterly conference calls to predict restatements in the 10Qs. So each 10Q would have an associated conference call. And so if the conference call has deception in it, then the 10Q should be, or what they say in the paper is kind of weird. If the 10Q is restated, then the conference call has deception in it. Okay? Yeah, it is a big assumption, but that's what they say. Okay, so here's what they're trying to get at. This is straight from the paper. They want to improve the assessment of whether reported financial statements are intentionally misstated. Okay? And what is their approach? They analyze linguistic features present. You know, in these quarterly conference calls, you have the CEO and CFO, and they want to see if their statements have deceptive cues. So in their speech, are they being deceptive? Is there anything that they can parse out of what they said? Okay? They can later let them predict whether the financial reports were deceptive or not. So what are the contributions of this paper? Well, these are their claims, okay? So models based on linguistic categories have statistically better or equivalent predictive performance compared to various accounting models that rely on discretionary accruals. Deceptive CEOs and CFOs use more references to general knowledge, fewer non-extreme positive emotion words, fewer references to shareholder value. And compared to CFOs, deceptive CEOs use more extremely positive words and fewer anxiety words. And compared to CEOs, deceptive CFOs use more words of negation and extremely negative emotion words. Okay, so in other words, they find linguistic differences between CEOs and CFOs, and they feel like this is useful information for improving on these accounting models that already exist to predict performance. Okay. So they take a similar approach to one of our other papers. Which one was it? Was it Feng Li? Where they say, all right, we're going to develop all these new hypotheses and test them, and they give little short descriptions of why they hypothesize a construct to have a certain relationship with fraud, or deception in a certain direction. All right, so when they're creating these hypotheses, so for example, one hypothesis would be, or one research question would be, do CEOs or CFOs use more words in their conference calls when they're being deceptive? Okay, so when they're coming up with these basically motivations for deception or underlying reasons for deception, they look at these 4 perspectives of how deceivers feel, or what affects deceivers, okay? So from the emotion perspective, they say, well, there are these deception theorists who say, well, deceivers feel really guilty, and they're afraid to get caught, so that's going to influence how they talk. So if I'm afraid to get caught, maybe I'll distance myself as much as possible from the crime. I won't reference myself. I'll always say they, or maybe even we, but I won't say I did something. I might use the passive voice, okay? So the cognitive effort perspective is just saying that it's difficult to lie. So if someone's going to lie, we're going to be able to detect cues that it was a very difficult task. So they're saying without time to rehearse, which is funny because these conference calls would have been rehearsed as much as possible. Verbal statements should, for example, lack detail compared to a truthful statement where you don't have to think hard at all. You just have to access the information and spew it out. So in the control perspective of deception, they say that liars avoid producing self-incriminating statements. So this makes me think of when you have the right to remain silent. You're not going to say anything that will be used against you in a court of law. Well, in the control perspective, deceivers are going to just avoid saying things that are self-incriminating. I mean, they're not going to just remain silent, but because they're lying and not telling the truth, this is basically their strategy. So this might also affect the content of these conference calls. Perhaps they're avoiding certain topics or something like that. And then there's this idea of lack of embracement, where liars aren't able to produce the conviction necessary to be able to tell a good lie. It makes them uncomfortable. And so maybe they have really abbreviated answers. So this is what happens when I'm lying to my mom. She'll look at me in the eye, and all I can do is say, just shake my head or nod my head. But I know that if I try to give a detailed response, she'll be able to tell I'm lying. So I need to talk around things. Okay. So these are basically the 4 perspectives that the author took when deciding how they thought liars would talk in a conference call. Okay, so I need to skip ahead here. So what they did is they took the Luke dictionary. We've talked about this before. It's one of these psychosocial dictionaries developed by a psychologist, Pennebaker, over at UT Austin. So they use this existing dictionary. There are maybe, it's a collection of dictionaries. There are maybe 60 to 80 dictionaries, like positive emotion, negative emotion, swear words, things like that. So they use these dictionaries in their analysis, okay? But they also create new dictionaries besides those. And this is my favorite part of the whole paper, how the dictionaries that they identified. So they have this dictionary called Reference to General Knowledge, which I thought was very good of them to create. So what does that mean? So let me go back to the table here. And so in Table 1, Panel B, he gives the exact words that are in the dictionaries. So this reference to general knowledge, it's really nice. So the there are some phrases. So you know, you guys know, you folks know, you well know, you long know. So they come up with all these different phrases and permutations of them. And they say the deceivers are going to use these more than truth tellers. And it's basically the idea is I'm going to build you up, or I'm going to just put words in your mouth to validate what I'm about to say. Okay, you know this, you guys know, or everyone knows. And the reason I like this dictionary is because I've observed this phenomenon in another setting, but I only measured the phrase you know. But he has a nice list of different phrases. So in this other setting was actually, as a PhD student, I was looking at what are called pre-polygraph interviews. Basically, the guy who's going to administer a lie detection test, he has to first, to create the test, he has to first interview the suspect. So it's just a long-winded, 1 hour long interview, maybe, about the crime and all these different types of questions. And I noticed that the ones who were later found guilty of the crime, I had the data there, they would always say something like this, like, you know. Just that one phrase. They would say it to this polygraph investigator, polygrapher. And so I just did a simple t-test to count how many times, or the rate at which each group, innocent and guilty suspects, use the phrase you know. And I got really close. I think they were either barely or almost like significant at the 0.05 level. Now maybe I would have gotten better results if I had had a nice dictionary like this that was created in this study. So, yeah, I really like that dictionary they made. Okay, so that's my favorite part of the study. These other ones I don't care as much about. So they read these statements and figured they needed new dictionaries. One is about shareholder value, one about value creation. And here's a really interesting one. Hesitations. So if you look at the words in the hesitations dictionary, you get blah, oh, sigh, and z. Guess that means they're sleeping. Actually, I think it means that they, what's the word? They couldn't understand what was being said. So they just put some placeholder for that. Now in this study they say they found very few hesitations. Now why do you think that is? It's all rehearsed? Okay. Well, of course the first part is rehearsed because they're reading a statement. Then there's the Q&A session. Yeah. I think they looked at both parts. Maybe I misread it. What did you say? So they speak more fluently. Is that what happens for you? You speak better when you're nervous? Okay. Well, I'll tell you the real reason is because these transcriptions are cleaned up. You know, they take out most of the hesitations. So there are no ums or ers or ahs. There's very few, at least, according to the authors. You know, they download these off of, I can't remember the name of the repository. Yeah. Ah. Yeah. You know, I'm about to lie.
Hey, Kevin.
Yeah.
You said you know about 3 times in the last 2 minutes.
I know.
Careful.
Okay, well, as you can see, you can't generalize all results to everybody, but I'll stop saying it. Okay, well, with these early linguistic studies, you can say that there's no baseline yet. So maybe this is okay right now, but subsequent studies should improve on that. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know why they. I don't know why they include it.
I mean, it might be of interest that some of the speech pattern has a lot of, pause and
So I think it's very interesting. So what I did is I got a hold of some audio files from these quarterly conference calls. I got 40 of them that were marked as containing irregularities, like, which is stronger than saying, what's the other word? Anyway, it's like a fraud. So, yeah, right. It wasn't just a material misstatement. These are irregularities. So I have these 40 conference calls that are pretty strongly, they have deception in them for sure. And I have a matched set of 40 calls for similar companies in the same year and all that stuff. So I ran this test. It was okay. So I took the audio calls and I sent them to a transcription service, and I told them to do a verbatim transcription. So they have all of the hesitations, or what I call them non-fluencies or disfluencies. And I have other hesitations besides the ones here. Like sometimes they repeat a word, like that. Or what else? Sometimes a word is garbled or something. Maybe they misspeak. So I did a little test, and the results are like significant at the 0.06 level, where one of the groups uses hesitations at a higher rate than the other group. So I don't know. Is that good enough? It's such a small data set.
Yeah, the question I have is like the benchmarking, like, every CEO and CFO is different, I imagine. I mean, I know there's like an average you're looking at for this, but I guess the question is, I think they mentioned it in the discussion where there's like slight differences that may be normal for that individual, and how you have, and then they come across as being abnormal behavior.
Well, you'd have to have some sort of repeated measure to do benchmarking, which I don't have in my data set. And yeah, so, but which group, the deceptive or the truth tellers, used more hesitancies or hesitations? Well, you don't, but you say there's a similar company where there's been no instance of fraud, there's been no misstatement in the past 5 years or whatever. There's been no restatement in the past 5 years. I don't know. You do your best, but you can never know. All right. So, how do you? Who used more hesitations in my sample? The truth tellers or the deceivers? Yeah, in my sample. Remember, I have 40 quarterly conference calls of truth tellers and 40 deceivers. Yeah. And yeah, it was actually the truth tellers. They used more hesitations. Okay. And here's another couple of dictionaries where they felt like it wasn't enough to say that there were positive or negative words, but we needed these extremely positive and extremely negative words in a separate, and look at them separately. Okay, let's go back. So, based on their understanding of deception theory and those like 4 perspectives we talked about, these are their basically hypotheses. So what this means is, so for first person singular pronouns, which would be I or me. And the negative sign means they believe that deceivers use fewer first personal singular pronouns. Okay? And I don't know that we need to go through all of these. So the plus minus would mean they're not sure which way it would go. So there's sort of a lack of theory behind each of these hypotheses in general, I'd say. And there's also, they don't discuss in very much depth the different perspectives that different deception theories might have on the use of these constructs in deceptive speech. So we'll talk about that in a bit. That's one of the criticisms from Bloomfield. Okay, so let's see. So here's an interesting one. So they believe deceivers will use fewer assent words. And I can't remember their reason for thinking that. So they won't say yes. So I just finished a paper on a different data set with 911 calls. It was actually not really an accounting paper, but it's something I worked on as a PhD student, and it was published, so that was nice. So we had this exact same construct, assent words. And we had deceivers and truth tellers too. And our deceivers were people who called 911, claimed to have witnessed a murder, and pretended not to be the one who committed the murder, but they were the one who committed the murder. Okay, those are our deceivers. And then the truth tellers were people who called 911, said they witnessed a murder, and they didn't actually commit the murder. Okay. So in our results, the deceivers used way more assent language than the truth tellers. So when they're talking to the 911 operator, they're very likely to listen to the suggestions of the 911 operator and just say yes, or also they might just give shorter answers, like a yes/no answer, instead of a long explanation. So there's a lot of different reasons why you might see more assent words, but it is true that the deceivers in that data set they're more pleasant to talk to. You know, oh, I didn't do it. Oh, you want me to do this? Okay. And they would just basically follow the prompts of the 911 operator. So the important lesson there is, depending on the context, even within accounting, you might expect different results for the same linguistic cue. So quarterly conference calls, you have to reevaluate everything when compared to what you would expect in the 10K or the MDNA. Yeah, so they didn't find very many swear words in their sample either, but they found some. I'd like to know which swear words they were. Probably minor ones. Okay. So they believe deceptive calls would show less certainty and more tentativeness. Okay, that makes sense on the faces. Okay. Right, so here's the controversial part of the paper, but what they had to do was decide beforehand which conference calls were deceptive. And they found, a ton of them. ton of deceptive conference calls. And I think they were very liberal in their application of the term deceptive, and that's just because I believe whatever Bloomfield said about it too. So basically they did this. They used the conference call transcripts and they associated them with their quarterly financial statement that would have been released at the same time as the conference call. So if there was a restatement, then they labeled the conference call as deceptive, because obviously management knew something and they didn't tell the analysts about it in the conference call. Okay, does that sound fair? That's what they did. So they categorized these restatements or by severity, in a sense. So they have these different filters. They have the non-trivial restatement filters, and these were the criteria for that filter: material weakness disclosure, late filing, audit or change. All right. They had what's called the irregularities or accounting issues filter. I didn't go to the Henne's paper to see how they define irregularities. And they looked at restatements related to revenue recognition or expense recognition. They had another filter just called irregularities. And this one, they went to news articles, press releases, and they looked for the words restate to filter through those articles. And then they also looked for, within those articles, fraud or irregularity. And then they looked through AAERs, and they searched for the term fraud or material misstatement for the companies they were interested in, and looked for a restatement quarter in the AAERs. So what they ended up doing is they took their 19 linguistic cues, and they basically tested them 4 separate times on these 4 different sets of conference calls, depending on the type of restatement. Okay, so if it was NT, IR, AI, and so on. So they quadruple the number of tests by setting these different filters. But not only that, they then double the number of tests again, because they look at CEOs and CFOs separately. So I figured, in all, just looking at basically the linguistic cues and all these different tests, there are 19 times 4 times 2, which is like 152 different tests that they ran. What's going to happen if they do that? Yeah, you're going to get at least 5% correct, or as statistically significant. And a handful are going to be significant at the 1% level, 1 or 2. No matter what, even if it's all garbage, you're going to find statistically significant results. That's my kind of study. How can you correct for that? How can you correct for that? Anyway, you guys thought about that?
Well, you kind of have to say from clustering too, right? So, I don't know. I have a hunch, but they might be able to work with it, at least in the clustering atmosphere. And I don't know if you can generalize what you're talking about, but so in one study I'm doing, I have 150,000 objects. So when I do means tests on the resulting clusters, of course I get these Z values that are just astronomical. That's not surprising. So what I'm trying to do at that point is then go back and take a systematic random sample of a reasonable number of objects, and then do my statistical testing again and see what happens.
Okay. And how's it work? Oh, have you done it? Yeah.
And it's much more reasonable. So maybe something like that.
Yeah. Okay. Anyone else? So the extreme measure to correct for this is to apply a Bonferroni correction. So what is that, Denise?
So basically, the idea is that you can prove anything to be correct if you narrow down the specific correct, narrow it down enough, make specific enough of everything to be significant.
Okay. So in the Bonferroni correction, you basically take this p-value that you're looking for, 0.05, to test for significance, and you add a denominator, which is the number of tests that you're running, basically. So let's say we're just looking at one variable, okay? Then it should work just fine, you know. We're looking for a significance of 0.05, and we'll report it, and we'll be good. But if we have two variables, then the chances increase that we have a spurious result. So let's divide by 2 the 0.05. Now we're only reporting significance if it's significant at the 0.025 level. So if you have 20 variables, then you divide by 20, and so on. It's very, very rigid. And it's been sort of debunked in some papers, because in my 911 call paper, they said, well, you're testing 10 variables, but you don't have a Bonferroni correction. And we're like, well, if we add a Bonferroni correction, we won't have any results. Because it's so... Oh, yeah, well, you know all these cartoons. So what we had to do is we had to go through the literature and look up this one paper that's cited by everyone who has my problem, so it has so many citations, over 1,000 citations. For everyone who doesn't want to have to do a Bonferroni correction, you have to cite this paper, which we did, and reviewers let it go. Yes, but I didn't think, you know, it depends. You know, if you have strong theoretical reasons for predicting that your constructs should have, you know, go a certain way, then you shouldn't really need a Bonferroni correction. You're going to get about type 2 errors, significant stuff that you don't report as significant. So I guess there's a balance there. But if you're doing a purely exploratory study, I think it makes more sense. Well, they say their study is exploratory, so. Okay, so these are the results. So this column on the left is for CEOs, and the column on the right is for CFOs. Basically, if there's a plus there, that means when CFOs in these deceptive quarterly earnings calls, they had a higher word count. I wasn't sure how they measure word count. Just the raw word count or number of words per minute. I'm not sure. Probably the raw word count. Okay, and so on. So third person plural pronouns. You know, there was agreement. They both used. The deceivers used they less. I think they would have used it more. And so on. Reference to general knowledge, they got good results. This one, you know. And they found that deceivers did use those references more often than truth tellers. Okay? Right. So that's all I'm going to show about that paper. I want to get into the Bloomfield paper that criticizes, or basically criticizes that paper. Okay? So there are 3 areas that I'm going to go over. So they bring up the issue that there could be spurious results. Bloomfield discusses, and he discusses what, I guess this paper was presented in a conference, and so he discusses some of the things that other attendees at the conference were talking about. So there are conflicting theories of deception, and then he goes through this funny, I can't remember what he called it before, but this funny phrase, or basically he argues that executives are not being deceptive. If they are, then it would be easily detected by investors. And even if investors did detect the deception, oh wait, this should be if they are would not be easily detected by investors. Oh, I should change that. And if investors did detect the deception, the Larker paper still would not detect the deception, okay? Okay, so we talked about this already, why there's such a large threat of spurious results. So one thing that I noticed, and maybe you guys didn't, maybe you guys can correct me if I'm wrong, but it didn't seem like the authors went into great detail to how they thought, what the mindset was of these CEOs and CFOs. Okay? So remember, we talked about the 4 different deceptive points of view of how deceivers might be influenced. But the authors didn't really say, yeah, I would file them, the CEOs and CFOs in these conference calls, I'd file them here. You know, they're going to feel guilty and they're going to feel like they're afraid to get caught. Or I'd file them here or here or here. Or do they think it's just a blend of all 4 perspectives? Okay. Yeah, I mean, what do the authors think? They mention these different perspectives on how deceivers might be behaving. You know, is it emotions that are going to drive how they speak? Is it this cognitive effort? So I was going to ask you guys, what do you think? What do you think is going to most impact deceptive speech? If a CEO or CFO is just flat out telling lies, what's going to get them to get caught, basically? Yeah. On the background, right? Depend on the background of the CEO. Okay, so it depends. Stick a thumbtack in your toe and you can defeat the lie detector test. But what do you guys think? What do you think would drive deceptive behavior? Do you think CEOs will try to control what they say, or do you think we can't know? So if you thought that, then you wouldn't use that reasoning behind any of your hypotheses in the paper, right? But they didn't really say in the paper which perspective they rely on the most. So. Kristen? Mm-hmm.
The cognitive effort piece in terms of like trying to fabricate the lie and trying to maintain it and not mess up in your statement. I think that's very difficult for anyone. So I think even if you're a good liar emotionally, it's hard to cognitively keep that lie up and not mess up after closing the statement.
Okay, so you would take away these 2 and focus on these 2?
Yeah.
So the point is, these issues need to be thought through, I think more carefully explained in that paper. So Bloomfield argues that maybe it's the case that executives aren't being deceptive at all. And that would basically kill the paper. I mean, what's the title of the paper? Detecting Deception, Deceptive Discussions. So what if they're not lying at all? Then you can throw these deception theories and the whole paper out the window, right? Yeah.
They're all lying. How much? I mean, their job is to exaggerate. They obviously want to look better than they are. Okay? So, unless the lawyers had a very serious conversation with them about liability,
Mm-hmm.
typically, at least the two lawyers I have been involved with, they lie. And the question is how much they exaggerate. And the other question is what are they hiding? They're always hiding something. There are certain things they would lie. Okay.
Right. Okay. So I like that. They're all liars. Well, what if they're not? And what if none of them lie? Okay. So we have to follow Bloomfield's train of thought.
It's an exaggeration, a lie.
Right. Guess it depends whether you get caught or not. No, it depends on the amount, whether it's material or not. Okay. So Bloomfield argues that SEC documents are, I mean, there's research that shows that are far more likely to allege the CFO is reckless rather than an orchestrator of financial fraud. Okay. So maybe they're reckless? Okay, so this one paper shows that 25% of AK restatements are due to irregularities. Only 25%, so that would be like a fraud. And then the 75% are due to mistakes, material mistakes or something. And let's say that there are errors and the executives may not be aware of them. Well, there's an explanation for that too, okay, in the next slides. But if maybe they're not lying at all, and maybe there's something else that is driving the results. Maybe they're detecting something else. Yeah, they're nervous. Probably not nervous. I mean, I wouldn't think that was not mentioned in the paper. What else? Okay, so there's this point. Maybe they're just not being deceptive. Okay, Bloomfield argues that deception is not easily detected, even though I didn't really like this part of the Bloomfield paper because, yeah, executives try to control their speech, and that's one of the deception perspectives that we talked about, how deceivers try to control their speech, and you can still detect it. Well, he says executives are selected for their ability to sound credible. Okay, maybe, is that true? You sound credible, you're the CEO. Executives exercise power to determine who is permitted to ask questions in conference calls. Okay, so that's true, right? So they don't come into these conference calls not knowing who's there or not knowing who's going to ask questions. Even the Q&A part is partially scripted, right? They know what questions are going to be asked, and they've even rehearsed for them. Okay. That's how they pick what? Oh, newscasters. But is that how they pick CEOs and CFOs? The two people in conference calls? I mean, maybe it's.
That taller people are more get paid more and so on, right? For the same reasons. Sound credible, you sound authoritative. Because if you don't, I don't think you'll become a CEO.
Yeah, I agree with that. Well, anyway, so this is what Bloomfield is arguing. Okay, so Bloomfield also says that maybe it's not deception at all that's being detected in this paper. This is from Bloomfield. Executives' linguistic behaviors arise because they possess evidence of poor current and or future performance. Whether or not they try to deceive investors during conference calls or even whether they believe the evidence they hold is on balance bad news. So I think what Bloomfield's saying here is that just bad news can cause executives to change their language patterns. So let's look at these examples. So here's some examples where Bloomfield says linguistic responses could mirror deceptive cues, okay? So let's see. Executives who hold unfavorable evidence will exhibit linguistic behaviors similar to deceivers. They may convey the news to investors like doctors convey bad news to patients. So they might let them just gradually in on the bad news. And this may be similar to how deceivers talk. You know, they try to, maybe they're not as blunt. They use the non-immediate cues. Maybe they don't, they use passive voice or something like that. So there's a study he cites that shows that this speech that doctors use to convey bad news is similar to deceptive speech. And maybe that's how the CEO and CFO are talking when there's bad news. Okay. Executives may face investors who are already aware of the bad news, so this may lead to defensiveness. And defensive speakers could use techniques, or do use techniques, that could look deceptive. So they're trying to brush away the blame, they're trying to, I don't know all the ways they talk. Okay, managers may not believe the news is bad. They may be deceiving themselves. And guess what? Self-deception looks like regular deception. I didn't know that, but that's what Bloomfield is saying. And I think he cites a paper. So if I'm lying to myself, it's just like I'm lying to you guys. Maybe that's why I don't like people who aren't honest with themselves. Oh, and bad news creates stress, and language reflects this. Stressful language looks like deceptive language. Okay, so there's all these reasons why Larker and Zakoliukina, I don't know how to say. There's all these reasons why they may have found results that aren't actually linked to deception. Yeah. Yeah, so maybe Bloomfield and conference attendees would have been happier with the paper if they were detecting bad news instead of detecting deception. But all of the constructs, the linguistic constructs, were sort of underpinned by deception theory in the paper, so you have to rewrite the whole paper.
Going back to LZ's paper, the main one, it's more of an archival study, so I'm curious, do they expect to take their findings and let's say they find list of words they've determined, they're more than others, they'll apply that to a current, conference call or something and be able to predict whether the person is lying or not?
Yeah, so they do some sort of similar cross-validation of their work where they do the testing, training set, and they, I don't remember the exact results, but that kind of insinuates that they would take their model and in the future. I mean, but if you're doing basic research, you don't care about future application. You just care about discovering the truth of nature. Okay? So basic research doesn't, and I assume they're doing something like that. It doesn't say that we have to go the next step and apply it. Now, if you want to do that, I mean, I think that's the right thing to do.
I found myself wondering when they talk about behaviors that the deceptive CEOs and CFOs, if anybody's reading that, say, okay, now I know how to behave, they see these studies,
Yeah. Well, I don't think anyone's going to look at this paper and change how they behave. And Bloomfield doesn't think that anyway. Okay. So what are Bloomfield's recommendations? Stronger design. That would either improve the results or eradicate the results. So if you have, I guess, a stronger link between the deceptive theory and your predictions, maybe you'll get better results, maybe you'll get worse results. Okay. Bloomfield said there's a real opportunity to go in more depth of identifying the differences between the two parts of the conference calls. And he calls for more experimental research to identify the causal factors in these deception studies. Okay, so in an experiment, how's that different from what can you do in an experiment? It's all about right. It's a very controlled environment. You change one thing, and you're trying to determine causation. If changing that one thing changes the results, then hopefully you have stronger indication of causation. Okay, so what time is it? 2:25.